Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Stay at Home. This is number 43. Today, we obviously have a new look, courtesy of Lauren, our graphic designer at Jacobin, and Cale Brooks, our producer, have been working on it. So hopefully you like the new graphics that'll be in the Stay at Home series. This commits us, of course, to continue Stay at Home for a while. We just started this a few weeks ago at the beginning of the quarantine, and I guess we're kind of committed to this now. So several times a week, we'll be continuing to do these broadcasts. And this week, we're wrapping up on Friday with David Broder, who will be talking about the rise and fall of the Italian Communist Party, and also a little bit about Apparismo and these other strands of Italian communism. So on Saturdays, of course, at 1 p.m. Eastern, we've been doing these weekends with Annika Sparran and Michael Brooks, our new weekly show. They have another great episode planned for Saturday. But today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Geoff Mann, who's a professor in the Department of Geography at Simon Fraser University up in British Columbia. And also, he's the author of two excellent books. He's a co-author of Private Leviathan, and he's the author of In the Long Run, We're All Dead, which has a subtitle that I keep forgetting: Keynesianism, Political Economy, and Revolution. So I'm a little bit off my game because I just sprinted to the office to get here 10 minutes ago and had to install a webcam because I'm doing this in a desktop for the first time. This entire series, I'm actually broadcasting from the very desolate Jacobin offices. So we'll be talking today about Keynes and about Keynesianism. So obviously, for those of us on the left, we're often considered Keynesian by conservatives and others who don't really know better. They conflate any system that has any dose of state intervention or does anything to alter perfectly functioning free markets as some sort of manifestation of the left. Of course, Keynes came from the liberal tradition in the UK. A lot of his acolytes, people that were in his tradition, like Joan Robinson and others, of course, came from more radical traditions. But there's always been a bit of tension in this relationship between Keynesianism and the left, and in Keynes's own very interesting political biography. We'll hear today for about 30 to 45 minutes from Geoff, who's going to give us a kind of a slight expansion on some of the things in his book, and he'll talk, and then after that we'll have a Q&A. If you want to participate in this Q&A, all you have to do is put your questions into the YouTube chat. We'll get to as many of them as possible. And of course, our only ask this entire series isn't for money. It isn't for anything else. It's for the pure vanity of your likes and your subscribes. It will make us feel very good about this effort. But more importantly, of course, it will allow us to reach more and more people. That's how the YouTube algorithm works. Right now, we're speaking to just a small part of our audience. And we're speaking to a lot of people who are already committed to the politics of the left. But we hope to be building an archive over the long run that will exist and be a political education resources for not just this, but future generations of activists. And we also hope to really make a dent in the YouTube discourse. And I know we have some really good left YouTubers. I mentioned Annika Sparran and Michael Brooks, who are doing a show with Jacobin. There's Kyle Kolinsky. There's a whole host of other people who are on the left, but it really is, by and large, a den of reaction. So with that, without any further ado, I'll let you take it away, and please go ahead, and we'll do some questions afterwards. So everyone watching, please do put your questions in the YouTube chat. But thank you for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to this one.
Thanks a lot. So are we good to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
we're on.
Okay, so today I am trying to do, I think, maybe a little bit too much, but hopefully it will be interesting enough to to keep people engaged for a while. What I want to talk about today is, to some extent, a kind of intro to Keynesianism, to introduce people to the ideas that are associated with Keynes and with Keynesianism, and then to not only work through that in a little bit of detail, not too much detail. I want then to turn near the end of the discussion to why this matters for us right now, especially in this moment, this very specific moment, actually, in which the recovery from the pandemic, of course, is a question on everyone's lips, and the answer pretty much nobody knows. But everybody knows that it's an opportunity for change. And that can mean lots of good things or a lot of bad things. And the function of Keynes and Keynesian economics will be central to that debate, I think. So here is just a brief outline of the talk, and it really is this simple. So if there's anybody out there who's super interested in the technical details, there's lots of stuff to read on that. I myself have written a fair bit on the technical part, but I'm going to stick at a kind of sensibility level around what I understand to be Keynesian political economy and the stakes it has. So first, I want to talk a little bit about who Keynes was and why he's back now. And he seems to keep coming back. He was back in 2008 as well. Secondly, I want to go into a little bit of detail about what Keynes said and why he said it at the time that he said it in the 1930s, 1920s, and 1940s as well. Then I want to look at his ideas, mostly from his famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which was published in 1936. Most of you probably know that. And I also want to distinguish it from what today we call Keynesian economics. The two are not equivalent. And that is a really crucial distinction. When we hear Keynesian economics raised today, we have to ask what kind of variety, in some ways, it is. And then finally, as I said, I want to talk about why this matters right now. So this is a cover of Time magazine from 1965. At the time, Keynes was probably fairly described as maybe the economist king, though he was no longer around. He died in 1946. But he was the economist king, to some extent, of post-war liberal capitalism. And how he got there is an interesting story, one that we probably can't go into in the detail that would be fun, to be honest with you. It really would be fun. I'm not even joking. But I encourage you to read the work of Robert Skidelsky if any of you are at all interested in his life, because he actually led a fascinating life. He was effectively an Edwardian gentleman, a reasonably wealthy bourgeois elite from Cambridge. He ended up doing all his schooling at Cambridge University, but he grew up in a faculty house. His mom was the first woman mayor of Cambridge. They were, they were at the top of the social hierarchy, but he was also famously progressive, you might say, in the terms of the time. He was a bisexual. He circulated very widely in the artistic community. He was very tight with the Bloomsbury Circle, Virginia Woolf, Leonard Woolf, Lytton Strachey, a whole slew of elite art folks from the time. And as he became more and more wealthy himself, mostly from currency trading, he became quite a patron of the arts as well. So he led this kind of unbelievably public, but also to some extent flamboyant life. And actually later in his life, he married the most famous ballerina of the age, Lydia Lepakova. So he just had this very fascinating time. He also, of course, from a political, economic, and political perspective, was central to many of the key events, at least in Western Europe at the time. He was actually a part of the British negotiating team at Versailles in 1919, and was so disappointed with the attempt to crush Germany with reparations following the war that he wrote a book that basically made him who he was, made him famous. The Economic Consequences of the Peace, where he described the effort to crush Germany after the war as going to lead, not only would Germany not be able to pay, but it would also react. And he famously, some people feel, predicted the rise of the Nazis. But though Economic Consequences of the Peace made him famous, his most noteworthy work came out in 1936, as I mentioned, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And in that book, he claimed in a letter to George Bernard Shaw that he was going to revolutionize economics. Now, I'm not so sure he did, but he definitely changed things up a lot. The book was a product of its time. You know, it's basically the depths of the Depression, and he's looking around at the economics of the moment, which he called classical, and many other people called treasury school economics. And it was what we would think of as very strict laissez-faire economics, really committed to free markets, the idea that the market would take care of itself. It was the most efficient and most responsive mechanism to bring things back into order. And this is 7 years into the Depression by 1936, and things are not better. Unemployment is at 25%, higher in actual fact. There's bankruptcies, there's debt, there's deflation, there's a series of economic disasters ongoing, despite 7 years of supposed recovery mode on the part of markets. And he just said, this is not actually how capitalism works. The Treasury school's thinking is a disaster, and things will not take care of themselves. This is, in fact, I would say, if you can remember one phrase from this as your summary of Keynesian economics, it's that things will not take care of themselves. That is the key mantra, one might even say, today as much as then. The book caused a bit of a shitstorm, and some people took it very seriously, and others opposed it vehemently. But it definitely exacerbated and increased Keynes's image, and he eventually ended up actually joining the government effort to fund the war. And he wrote a famous pamphlet called "How to Pay for the War." And eventually, of course, as many of you will know, ended up at the table establishing the Bretton Woods institutions in 1944. He had quite a more open, and I would say, in the most general sense, progressive idea of what those institutions would look like than actually came to be. But he was involved. He was at a lot of tables. A very interesting person, and all of this work. The things will not take care of themselves. The state has a key role to play, were the lessons that were learned by many economists across the capitalist world coming out of the Second World War. And this is how he ends up on the cover of Time magazine in 1965. Here we are, Keynesian influence on the expansionist economy, you can see. So this was really a status that he enjoyed, let's say his economics, and then what we would now call Keynesian economics enjoyed right up through till the late 1960s. And then things went south. So here I have a picture, it's a screen capture from a very famous presidential address in 2003, by Robert Lucas, who one might think of as the consummate anti-Keynesian. But I want to preface this with a little story about how we got to this in 2003. So by the early 1970s, as many of you will know, the global political economy, at least in the capitalist part of the world, really seemed to be kind of falling apart. We had, across the capitalist world, in particular, countries were facing skyrocketing inflation and unemployment that was rising at the same time. Now, according to standard post-war Keynesian theory, these two things were supposed to move in opposite directions. So if there was inflation, it would increase employment and decrease unemployment, obviously. And if we had low inflation, then that would increase unemployment. And so these two things were supposed to move in opposite directions. And all of a sudden, they were moving very rapidly in the same direction. This was seen as a real shot to any legitimacy that Keynesian theory still enjoyed. And it had started to quake a little bit in the 60s. And at this moment, a set of economists who we've since come to name by a bunch of different names, monetarists, new classical, rational expectations, a whole variety of schools of explicitly anti-Keynesian, anti-state intervention economists took their opportunity. And as the most famous of them is Milton Friedman. And the goal, of course, was to roll back the state, to get the state out of the way. It was said to be the problem, the reason for the inflation, the reason for skyrocketing unemployment. And so in that gap, those economists and business elites took, in some ways, you can say, took apart the Keynesian edifice and rebuilt the economy that we would now call neoliberal. This is really the origins of neoliberalism, at least as it's sort of conventionally used. And so this is a quote from 2003. It begins, I have it here only because it's only just a couple of years before the big financial crisis hit, but this is the level of arrogance to which we had attained in terms of the victory of that anti-Keynesian economics. And you can see here, this is Lucas, as I said, again, probably the most influential, certainly anti-Keynesian, even more so than his teacher, Friedman. My thesis in this lecture is that macroeconomics in this original sense has succeeded, he says, in 2003. Its central problem of depression prevention has been solved. It's kind of funny when he said this. For all practical purposes, and has in fact been solved for many decades. There remains important gains in welfare from better fiscal policies, but I argue that those gains these are gains from providing people with better incentives to work and to save, not from better fine-tuning or spending flows. In other words, we really didn't have much more to worry about. We'd figured it all out. This is 4 years before the whole kit and caboodle goes over the cliff in the financial crisis. And so that meant, in that moment of emergency, 2007, 2008, which many of you are probably old enough to remember quite well, all of a sudden Keynes is back. Supposedly declared dead and gone in the 70s. 2008, he's like the hot ticket. This is just two headlines, one from the Wall Street Journal, the other from Time magazine. The comeback Keynes, the new old big thing in economics. Keynes was back like big time because he was, again, the reminder, the back pocket the economist in the back pocket of every capitalist state that reminded them that in an emergency you need a panic button, and Keynes was the panic button. Things will not take care of themselves. And so he was celebrated briefly, but celebrated quite widely. And in fact, again, his forgotten wisdom was, propounded by many very influential thinkers. Robert Skidelsky's book here, The Return of the Master, while a bit of an overstatement, one might say, is nonetheless really worth reading. It's an excellent book. It's also an excellent introduction to the economics that had gotten us into all this trouble. Of course, not everyone was really happy that he was back. Again, as Bhaskar said in the introduction, most people, at least on the sort of center right, think of Keynes as being to some extent a socialist, which is very far from true. But nonetheless, the association of the state meddling in the economy means that he's become a bit of a bugbear for virtually anybody who self-identifies on the right. And for the far right, like the Freeman, this screed here, he's a demon. So of course, 2008 comes along and he's back like some zombie. Now, Keynes was the definition in some senses of a public intellectual. But he was working, as I mentioned earlier, and as you all know, at a really particular time, a really complicated and volatile time. And this shaped everything he did. And here he is. I just wanted you all to hear what he sounded like, which is actually exactly what you'd expect. Like if I asked someone to imitate him, this is what they would sound like. Here he is speaking about the end of the gold standard at 1931.
There really seems to be some providence which watches over this country. 2 months ago, we were in an impossible position. For years past, our industry had been strangled by the exchange value of our money being too high, with the inevitable result that the cost of our goods was also too high for foreign markets. But how on earth were we to get loose in an honorable way? For our bankers, who had accepted foreign money at a high exchange value, felt that it would be wrong for us to change the value of our money voluntarily. As events have turned out, the change has been forced on us under circumstances extraordinarily fortunate and favorable. We have nothing to fear, honestly nothing. So often, in the past 10 years, I have had to prophesy evil. But now, a great weight is lifted from us, a great tension relieved. There's no danger of the exchange falling too far. There's no danger of a serious rise in the cost of living. The worst I should expect would be a return to the prices of some 2 years ago. But meanwhile, British trade will have received an enormous stimulus, much more than most of us have yet realized. It is a wonderful thing for our businessmen and our manufacturers and our unemployed to taste hope again. But they must not allow anyone to put them back in the gold cage where they have been pining their hearts out all these years.
Okay, so I hope everyone was as happy to confirm the sound of his voice as I was. And just to give a little bit of background, for those of you who don't know about the gold standard, though most of you do, the gold standard was the system that backed international, most currencies during the early part of the 20th century and the latter part of the 19th century. And it was intended to keep money at a stable value, but it also obviously, therefore, restricted states' capacity to print money because they could only print money that they had gold to back. And so in a situation like the Depression, when some people advocated a great deal of government spending, they weren't able to do so with their money supply constrained. And that meant that instead of the money supply expanding and allowing for a bit, say, of inflation, but also some stimulus to the economy, a falling demand meant that prices would fall, and deflation was a major worry at the time. In fact, it is as well right now. So the concern for Keynes was largely about deflation and a debt deflation spiral, which I'll explain in a sec. This is actually a very similar concern for many economists at the moment. And so here, let me explain to you what Keynes was worried about. But first, the first thing I want to do here is just to flag, before we move on, from now on, that, as I said before, the economics of Keynes is not the same as today's Keynesian economics. It could be, but most of the time it's not. And so when you hear Keynesian economics today, remember to think hard, I would suggest, about what exactly that entails. It can entail a lot of different things, and a lot of it can look very, very close to what you might think of as orthodox, mainstream, or neoliberal, so-called neoliberal economics. So the concern here is that for Keynes, the instability inside the economy is actually of principal concern because of the political instability, economic instability we'll visit upon any nation state that experiences it. And this was proven to him not only by his study of history, but also by his immediate experiences in the post-World War I era. And this is a very famous quote from The Economic Consequences of the Peace. As I said, this is from 1920, but it really foreshadows his view on the world right until his death in 1946. And he says here, this is a picture from the beer hall putsch in 1923, but he said in 1920, "Men will not always die quietly. Starvation drives temperaments to the nervous instability of hysteria and to a mad despair. And these in their distress may overturn the remnants of organization and submerge civilization itself." And this is what I would really want to emphasize, and it's certainly the main point of, or one of the main points of the book that Bhaskar mentioned, In the Long Run We're All Dead. Keynesian economics is a rescue mission for civilization. Not so much capitalism, actually. I would argue capitalism is a second order problem. But this is really what's at stake in the Keynesian sensibility. And so this is an explicit knock back at the so-called Treasury school, the idea that markets will take care of things, that if we just wait, the long-run equilibrium will return things to all engines firing. And he says this is not the case. This is basically the message that he conveys in the general theory 16 years later. And again, a second quote, this is from 1924 in the Tract on Monetary Reform. I'm just trying to give people a sense of where his economic thinking comes from. And this is the famous quote that from which the title of my book comes, and many other people quote it all the time. But this long run, in other words, the Treasury School's long run equilibrium, the promise that things will be okay if we wait things out, this long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we are all dead. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat again. So you can see his sense, if you think back to the previous quote from The Economic Consequences of the Peace, this isn't metaphorical. In the long run, we're all dead. He means that. If we don't deal with the short run, in the long run, we are dead. And so this is an existential question for him. So when he is celebrating the end of the gold standard and writing copious amounts at the time in the early 30s and then up to the general theory in 36. This is one of the main dynamics he's very, very worried about. As he sees it, the way that standard or classical economics works, this is where we're headed, where they were headed. This is what is famously known as the debt deflationary spiral. Again, something people are concerned about right now. And it can begin almost anywhere, of course, but let's begin at the top. So with falling demand, which of course we see right now, people either can't exercise their purchasing power or they won't because of the uncertainty about the future or lack of income, of course. Falling demand means that prices will fall in an attempt to keep sales up, of course. That means that businesses' revenues drop, and we see, especially right now, enormously overburdened, indebted businesses and enterprises defaulting on their debt, leading to bankruptcies, which of course leads to layoffs and wage reductions and other economic impacts, which only exacerbates the cycle. And so we end up in a debt deflationary spiral where it would be crazy on the part of any individual firm or to jump in and invest because things are only going down the toilet. And the desperate need to stop this toilet is also to stop this toilet from flushing is driven not necessarily just by the economic dynamics, but because of this fallout, like the potential precarity of civilization itself. This is the fundamental, I would say, insight, if you want to call it that, of Keynesian economics. And this is just a chart here to show you that, even though it's the way that the neoliberal era, let's say, or the economics that has dominated the last 40 years has made inflation the central concern of economic policymakers and the central concern of the state in terms of the market dynamics. This is actually historically a little bit unusual. For Keynes to be worried about deflation was made perfect sense at the time. If you look at this is just for the US, inflation from 1775 to the present, and you can see that deflation prior to the Second World War was almost as common, arguably even more common than inflation. So this was a very, very standard thing to worry about. And there was immediate historical memory that told people this was a concern. And you can also see, if you look at the peaks of the red, the inflationary moments, those are almost all associated with wartime. See the Revolutionary War, the so-called American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, the First World War, and the Second World War, all are big bumps in inflation. And all but the Second World War are followed by deep deflations. So this is following the Second World War. We've seen deflation throughout Britain, especially in the 1920s. And he is absolutely not unusual in his concern that deflation is heading here. But he is unusual in the belief that the current state of economics in 1930s was a disaster for this moment. So what does he propose? Well, he proposes a lot of things across a lot of books, but I'm going to focus here especially on the general theory, his most influential, and certainly I would argue, and so would everyone else, I think, his most important work. And again, I'm not going to get into the technical details of those economic propositions right now, but I do want to describe for you a couple of basic concepts and some sense of the sensibilities that drove this. So the first thing about that Keynes makes absolutely central, and it changed economics. If anything revolutionized economics, this is what it did, is that he put uncertainty at the center of everything. Individual investors, individual consumers, workers, but investors and entrepreneurs especially, they cannot know the future. They cannot know conditions. And because of that, they won't fully dedicate themselves to the all engines firing economy that the Treasury School and classical economics assumed would be the product of a kind of virtuous cycle that produced full employment equilibrium by constantly making room for, via the markets, increasing innovation, increasing production, increasing hiring, a virtuous circle that would recover from any bump. But he said that's not the case. Uncertainty is everywhere, and it's different than risk. Risk you can calculate, at least roughly, take a chance, a gamble on certain probabilities. Uncertainty is radical. It means as he said in 1937, we simply do not know. And the longer you go out in the future, the more and more uncertainty colors the future. And what this means is that people will virtually always, hold back a little. Some of their resources will not be turned back into the economy to produce that virtuous, all engines firing, full employment situation. There'll always be at least some, and sometimes a lot, of resources held out of production because of uncertainty. You never know what's coming. And money is crucial to this because money is a special commodity. Money is the most liquid commodity. It's the thing that you want to have when things go south because it's the most liquid. It's the most useful for acquiring other resources, for keeping in savings in case something goes bad or something good comes along. Money becomes crucial, and in that sense, it's a resource that won't be flowing fully back into the production process. People will keep it, and that the extent to which they keep it will be determined by the conditions they have around them and the level of their uncertainty. If they're really worried about the future, they're going to keep a lot of it. And if they're really concerned about missing a big opportunity that comes along, they're also going to keep a lot of it. And that means that their, in his terms, liquidity preference is high. If their liquidity preference is high, they prefer holding liquid assets to other kinds of assets. In other words, they prefer holding money or money-like assets. What this means, therefore, is that to get those resources into the economy, flowing, hiring people, producing things, getting out of a depression, let's say, we need to convince people that the money has to be, that the money can be put wisely into the economy. And this is where expectations come in. Expectations become central. They become the reason for which people participate or not in the economy, especially investors and entrepreneurs. And he called this at one point very quickly, entrepreneurs' animal spirits. And largely he meant it, I think. He was a little bit obsessed with Freud at the time. But I think he largely meant it in the sense that sometimes there is no reason at all to invest, but people do anyway. And so it was their animal spirits that were driving them. But regardless, expectations, which are, of course, massively uncertain, especially, as I said, farther and farther you go out, are condition everything. And so the state's role becomes managing what he called the state of confidence, expectations. And what this means, too, of course, is that if you can increase people's expectations that things are going to be good, they're much more likely to jump into the economy, to invest, to hire, these kinds of things that will become, in some ways, self-fulfilling prophecies. So one key way in which this plays out, and it's one of his more influential concepts, is this notion of effective demand. Now, a lot of people think that when Keynes said effective demand, he meant the kind of demand that consumers can actually exercise in the economy because, say, they have limited budgets. So I might want a fancy fishing boat, but because I don't have the money to buy a fancy fishing boat, I would only buy a rowboat. But that's not actually what effective demand means. Effective demand is actually a supply side variable. It's the demand for which producers produce that they anticipate having. So if I don't think anyone's going to buy my pianos next year, then I'm not going to produce very many. But if I think a lot of people are going to want pianos next year, then I'm going to decide now to produce a lot later. And so what we need is a situation in which, if expectations, or what Keynes felt we needed, was a situation in which we felt that investors and entrepreneurs felt expected a significant effective demand and therefore produced as close as possible to capacity. So it was all about this kind of confidence and expectations management, which you hear a lot of today, of course. But what this all means too, and this is really crucial to the politics of this, is that the standard Treasury School classical economics story that the markets would recover suggests that anyone who's not working is basically refusing to work at the going wage. Because if the free markets allow for instantaneous price movements, then the wage, as the price of work, is the one that's out there for workers to take. And if they don't take it, that's a choice. In other words, according to that old school thinking, which is back again big time, all unemployment is voluntary employment. Now, Keynes said, if you look at the way capitalism works, what I've just described, then inevitably it's going to be falling short of its goal, a so-called goal. And that means that the vast majority of people who aren't working would be working if they could. And they would be working even for less than the going wage. It's just that there is literally no place for them. Involuntary unemployment is a functional, structural part of the economy. And it's not just a function of the so-called search unemployment in times of where workers are moving from one job to the other. This is built in to the economy by the level of uncertainty and expectations. And all of this meant ultimately that Keynes's position is very, very pragmatic. It's like said, the theoretical questions are important, of course, but we need them to be appropriate to the world and, as he said several times, in which we actually live. So this pragmatism is fundamental to Keynesianism. One might argue even today, though, again, less so. Now, the last part of this talk is going to go a little bit fast. I apologize for that, because there's just so much to discuss. But one of the things that's crucial, of course, to talk about is the difference between that, which I just described, the economics of Keynes, and so-called Keynesian economics today. And right now, I'm going to focus on so-called mainstream Keynesian economics, by which I mean Keynesian economics that actually operates in the existing policy circles. There is a school of post-World War II Keynesian economics called post-keynesianism, which is actually very, very close, or much, much closer, let's say, to the economics of Keynes. In fact, in some cases, is far more left than he ever would have wished. For example, Stephanie Kelton, the main proponent, or one of the main proponents of modern monetary theory, is a post-Keynesian. Hyman Minsky, who many of you will have heard of, is a post-Keynesian thinker, or was a post-Keynesian thinker. There are several others out there, Tom Pally. There's some great, great economists, but they do not have, at least as of yet, the policymakers' chair to influence. And so I want to focus a little bit more here on how Keynesian economics works in actually existing economic policy. Now, it's taken a few varieties over time. These are in some ways stages. Immediately upon the end of the war, and in fact, almost immediately upon the publication of the General Theory in 1936, there was a school that merged effectively neoclassical or classical Treasury school economics with Keynesianism. And that arguably was the main economics behind the time when Keynes was the economist king, especially in the US. After the monetarist counter-revolution of the 70s and the imposition increasingly of a kind of neoliberal mode in economics, there was a response to that on the quasi-center-left liberals, that many of whom you will know, Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz being the leading lights, that often gets called New Keynesianism. And finally, we are in a moment right now that some call the new neoclassical synthesis, which is to overcome even the opposition of New Keynesianism and bring it under the neoclassical umbrella. And for lack of time and the essential background time together, I'm going to focus on basically the overall sensibility that this approach brings. The first key feature here is, if you remember the kind of suboptimal outcomes that Keynes showed to be so normal in capitalism, and the more you let the free markets work, the more likely these suboptimal outcomes are. No one could deny the empirical truth of that claim. And so much of the work of what we now call neoclassical economics was an attempt to make sense using the tools of classical economics and the orthodox assumption about rational action and optimization, to use those tools and to tweak them so they came up with Keynesian outcomes. In other words, so they came up with non-full employment outcomes, non-free market dream world outcomes. And effectively what they came up with, this is my own description, I'm not sure it works for other folks, but hopefully it does. But effectively what they came up with is they're glitchy market clearing models. Market clearing meaning free market, laissez-faire models. And that means that the models themselves are constructed almost pretty much exactly like old school free market laissez-faire models were, except for there's a great deal of a room for glitches, sticky prices, in other words, prices that don't adjust when the market suggests they should. Missing markets, i.e. when certain kinds of factors of production or other kinds of supply or geographical barriers produce situations in which the market should be providing something, there's a demand for it, but the supply isn't there because the market is missing, or the market fails to deliver the good at the volume required or at all. And so if you build market clearing models that can break down in little bits here and there, then you can produce Keynesian outcomes, suboptimal outcomes overall, while still using an equilibrium framework that doesn't fit, in my opinion, very well with Keynes's economics. The third and crucial thing is that expectations now are central to this thinking, which they weren't in the Treasury school of the 20s. But they are a very particular kind. They're called rational expectations today. And they're a key part of most macroeconomic models. And they're an attempt to put what are called micro foundations into macroeconomic models. In other words, to be so-called realistic about what rational actors would or would not choose to do. And the outcome of this, though, is to produce a situation in which the models themselves produce extraordinary stability over time because the expectations are rational, which in this case means that effectively agents within the modeled economy understand the model and they learn to anticipate its dynamics. And insofar as they learn over time to anticipate its dynamics, including reactions to policy changes, they end up producing the very expectations that they have because they understand how things work, and therefore they react rationally to lead themselves to their own expectations. And because on this model, the state's main goal is to maintain the rationality of those expectations, we find a kind of dream world in which the state and private actors together produce the world that they want to see over the long run. Now that, of course, has proven at least twice in the last 12 years to be a total disaster. But it is nonetheless a dominant mode of thinking. And one of my main concerns is that it will survive this pandemic. And finally, liquidity is also a problem. Everyone recognizes that today. No one's foolish enough to not think that. This is what the role of the financial system is supposed to provide. But of course, the financial system now is recognized on these terms, as they would say, to have more frictions than otherwise anticipated. And this was the great in the smallest letters possible, great lesson that was taught by the financial crisis. And so the economic policy has shifted a little bit to think about how finance operates and spends a lot more time thinking about it than it ever did before. But it nonetheless has an image that in a perfect world, finance can efficiently supply credit and liquidity pretty much instantaneously wherever it's required. In so doing, also distributing risk to those willing to bear it. Now, clearly we know that that's not the case because those who bear the risk get bailed out, the richer they are. And this is the world, just very briefly, I'm telling you nothing that you don't already know, but this is the world that this economics has produced. So this is, these are unfortunately just till 2016, I hope that's okay. This is a graph of the gains from total growth over the last, say, 30, 40 years. And you can see that, 28% of total growth, income growth has been captured by 1% of the population in the US and Canada and Western Europe. Standard, everyone knows this now. This is also, you can see that line, that little dotted line that divides this very famous graph is effectively the moment when Robert Lucas' rational expectations and the monetarist counter-revolution imposes itself on economic policy. It's literally almost that clean. And you can see since that moment, the devastating stagnation in real wages relative to productivity. This is across the US, but I have an identical graph for Canada. It looks exactly the same effectively. I just put it up here because I figured most listeners were Americans. Again, a product of exactly where we're at. And also more inequality. Pre-tax incomes, see this lunacy that has become standard. A situation in which the average top 1% earner in 2014, so 6 years ago, earned 1.4 million, while the average member of the bottom 50% earns $16,600 a year. The level of inequality is astounding, and it's actually worse now. If any of you have read Piketty's new book, Capital and Ideology, he has new data in there. And in the US, I can tell you, because I've just finished reviewing the book, the average income of the income of the average member of the top 1% is 80 times higher than the average member of the bottom 50%. And the wealth inequality is even worse. The average member of the top 1% owns 950 times more wealth than the average member of the bottom 50% in the US. Levels that are like, when you say them out loud, you can hardly believe that they persist. But those are the facts of the matter. And this is the world that these economics have not only helped produce, but actually gleefully defended for 40 years. This also has, of course, not just general impacts, but very specific impacts on particular marginalized groups. This is a map made with data from the ILO, the International Labor Organization, from 2016. So again, I apologize, a little bit outdated. But it's the percentage of youth aged 15 to 24 looking for but unable to work. In other words, these these are only the people who are counted in unemployment statistics. If you're not so-called looking for work, then you're a discouraged worker and you're assumed to be outside the labor force. You can see that, particularly in the developing world, it's devastating. This is before, it's devastating. And COVID obviously is only going to make this way worse. So this is very specifically generational. It's also gendered. This is a map of the gender dynamics of part-time work. You can see the vast majority of part-time work is held by women. Those are the first jobs that have been lost in many cases with COVID, and they almost always are. The gender dynamics of the impacts of this crisis are enormous. I'm clearly not the only one to say it, and they're much broader than just this. But again, same year, 2016, this is only going to get worse unless we do something. And this is where even standard, straightforward, so-called disinterested economic forecasts are suggesting we're going to end up with levels of unemployment considerably higher than the depths of the Great Depression in the US and elsewhere. Canada would be, of course, no different. Western Europe, the rest of the world. It's not a rosy picture. And all of this is going to be exacerbated, of course, by all of these dynamics are exacerbated, in some ways inscribed even deeper by COVID. Further scary graphs. You can see, especially on the bottom right there is a bit of a bullshit graph. It tells you that the average hourly pay is going up. That's only because most of the people who make so little have been fired or laid off. And the final thing I just want to talk about, again, is as I mentioned, why all this matters right now, why Keynesian economics matters right now. And the reason it matters is because at a moment like this, when everything's fucking falling apart, Keynes, I would argue, Keynesian economics has an extraordinary and very understandable appeal. It seems like the economics that says we'll do something and we desperately need to do something. But it's also, the depth of that is caught up inextricably, I think, with a very, what we might think of as conservative force, this desperate desire to save civilization. And I mean civilization in some ways in the most bourgeois, bland sense that it gets used. And here's a quote from 1934 in Breadlines. For one reason or another, time in the joint stock company and the civil service have silently brought the salaried class into power. Not yet a proletariat, blah, 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 blah. There is no massive resistance to a new direction. The risk is of a contrary kind. Again, the one that people sense now. Lest society plunge about in its perplexity and dissatisfaction into something worse. And then Keynes says, revolution is out of date. And it's this last sentiment that I think always lurks deep in Keynesian thinking. And so the question we face right now is, how can we call on Keynes in clearly an emergency when I think many people would agree that the state is the only institution that might be able to step in, at least in terms of the short-term needs of people really in bad shape. How can we do it in a way that doesn't bring with it this essentially conservative, status quo-oriented, in many cases, hierarchical politics? How do we do this and get beyond just the rescuing of the status quo in the emergency? And this, I think, is the underside of that the long run, the fear of an obsession with the long run. And here is a very less known but very useful quote, where he says, "It's our duty to prolong peace hour by hour, day by day, for as long as we can. We do not know what the future will bring, except that it will be quite different from anything we could predict." Again, uncertainty. I have said in another context that this is a disadvantage of the long run, that in the long run we're all dead, but I could equally well said that in the great advantage of the short run is that in the short run we're still alive. Life and history are made up of short runs. And if we're at peace in the short run, that is something. That is basically all we're hoping for. And that is always part of Keynesianism, right there. We're hoping to avert disaster, because ultimately, civilization is a thin and precarious crust erected by the personality and will of a very few, the technocrats and the experts, and only maintained by rules and conventions skillfully put across and guilefully preserved. This is the core underneath of Keynesian economics that we always need to be wary of. Because the fear, of course, is that we don't do enough, or we reject entirely the help that is possible because we are afraid of this. But at the same time, how do we manage that fear and manage that risk while making room for substantive, even revolutionary transformation? How can we not just rescue the status quo? Because the dynamic in history seems to be that the attempt to save the status quo leads to an intensified version of the status quo, under the impression or the claim that somehow that'll be a more stable version of the status quo. And I feel like we can see this about to happen right now. You know, Robespierre, the famous French revolutionary, once said, asked his colleagues, who he considered too conservative, would you like a revolution without revolution? And I guess I would say that in general, the Keynesian answer is yes, we definitely would. Thanks very much.
Wow, thank you, Geoff. That was great. It was way more comprehensive than I expected. And you know, often people want to do these lectures a little bit long, but I now realize why you want to do yours a little bit long, because you packed a lot in. So I'm really pleased that you gave us all of your time and you put together this material. And for those of you who just joined in halfway, we've been listening to Geoff Mann. He's the author of In the Long Run, We're All Dead, a really great introduction to Keynes. And of course, this video is going to be archived and will be around for a long time. So please press like and subscribe, check out his book. And obviously pressing like and subscribe is how the video gets to more people. So there's already a lot of questions. So I'll try to just jump into as many of them as possible. Before we get to the good, much better questions from the chat, I have one of my own, which is just kind of a historical one of the context in which the general theory was written. So I guess this book came out in 34. It's probably written in 32, 33, you know, around.
Came out in 36.
36. Okay, so it came out in 36. It was written a few years before. Around then, the Ramsay MacDonald Labour Party was in power for at least a part of that period, and they were committed to fiscal orthodoxy of a sort in response to the crisis. So what was it about this moment that committed so many of the social democratic or labor-based parties of Europe, the ones at least that were in power, minority governments at least, there was a few, to this orthodoxy, whereas it took someone from the liberal tradition to at least want to tinker. Obviously, it was far from radical and it was far from the fleshed out Keynesianism that came after, but at least wanted to tinker more with markets. I guess, can you talk about that context?
Sure. All right. I mean, I can to the extent that I'm familiar. This is a really good question. I think that there's a couple of larger institutional dynamics that matter at that time. The first is especially in Britain, let's say, and the Treasury enjoyed what we would now consider, I think, an extraordinary independence. Like, so insofar as its decisions were often taken as final, even by elected governments. And insofar as the Treasury was dominated by economists who thought that this, as you said, orthodoxy was the standard, that they really had the capacity in some senses to impose that, or at least to make it very difficult to do otherwise. The other difficulty is the gold standard, which had shaken or held back so much of the West's, let's say, specifically capacity to deal with the volatility that didn't just begin in the 30s, but especially in Britain, actually shook the whole country throughout the 20s. You know, the Great Strike of 1926, there's an enormous amount of instability at the time, but the gold standard was a real hindrance. And in fact, as you may know, Keynes in his early career was a fan of the gold standard, but by the 1920s, and in that tract on monetary reform in 1924, he really denounced it as a disaster. Since most countries had gone off it in the First World War, there was a lot of talk of bringing it back. The sound money Treasury folks wanted people to bring back the gold standard, and he thought that would be a disaster. And in the end, he wrote a pamphlet after Churchill did bring it back, just called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, which was the return to the gold standard, how disastrous that was. And as much of an asshole as Churchill was in most other dimensions, the one thing he did do is at the end of his career, he admitted that that was in his eyes, his greatest mistake, which says something about how he thought about his legacy, but regardless.
So I guess Peter Gowan just kind of made a off the mark, just said, with the honorable exception of the Swedish Social Democrats, which just reminds me, can you say anything about the relationship between, I guess what's often called the Stockholm School, of more social democratic economists or economists associated with the SAP when the SAP first was in power in the 1930s in Sweden and adopted more interventionist economic policies. A lot of their work seemed to be written, though you correct me, before Keynes's work, about the relationship between the two, or maybe what they were up to. I don't know, this is a little bit beyond the scope of your talk, so feel free to pass on it.
Mm-hmm. It's not only beyond the scope of the talk, maybe. It's also, to some extent, I would never want to claim to be an expert on Bertil Ohlin and the so-called Stockholm School, nor would I want to claim to be an expert on, the later social democratic Swedish framework associated with Meidner-Renn, both of which are frequently, put into conversation with Keynesianism, and particularly the latter is sometimes seen as sort of the apotheosis of what Keynesianism could have been. And I think in some ways, especially with the latter, Meidner-Renn and the Swedish social democratic state that still gets celebrated, we really see more radical work than happened in almost any other so-called Keynesian context, which not only underscores the variety of Keynesianisms that came into play, but it also, I think, points toward us thinking of the Keynesian economic sensibility as to some extent opening space for more radical interventions that would themselves have never been justifiable according to the logic of Keynesianism. But the political economic window it opened enabled some to make a great deal more progress than others did. I mean, we're really talking about a situation where, Paul Krugman is probably the most prominent Keynesian in North America today, and he's no Gustav Meiner.
And probably especially the model that Sweden developed by the 50s, this Renn-Meidner model especially, was really driven by the labor movement. It's driven by the LO. It's driven by centralized bargaining. And given what you just explained by Keynes's own background and political instincts and worldview, he probably wouldn't want to entrust that power to trade union officials and to workers. But
no way.
Yeah.
No way. Keynes was not a
Democrat.
Democrat. That's the key. Right. Keynes was not a Democrat. He didn't trust the people.
Mm-hmm. So there's a few questions about the structural crisis of the 70s, and I'll try to distill them down into kind of one question, which is, to what extent was the post-war consensus undermined by kind of a structural problem with the economic status quo at the time, or to what extent was it contingent factors like the 73 oil crisis or whatnot? One questioner puts it, if the 1973 oil crisis didn't happen, keeping the post-war consensus intact, would it have survived? Would it have stopped the rise of Reagan, Thatcher, and neoliberalism? So do you care to one, maybe introduce a bit about the crisis of the 70s, and about to what extent was neoliberalism a made-up solution to a made-up problem? To what extent there was something deeply flawed? And again, I realize that I'm now asking you to take on another 50-minute talk, but since people are curious, maybe you could at least start to point them in the right direction.
Sure. Again, I'll try and do it as briefly and as I can. And I'm going to begin with the cheater answer, which is both, when you ask about whether or not it's contingent or structural, in the sense that clearly it would be crazy to say that the contingent events of the moment, like the oil crisis or the Vietnam War or these kinds of forces, were not enormously important in the way that things unfolded. That seems to me to be indubitable. I got to use that word for the first time in my life. But it's also the case that there were so-called structural forces that produced the condition in which those contingencies could matter as much as they did. And I think foremost among those was the inflationary dynamic that built up across Western Europe and North America in particular at the time, that it's not really unfair to Keynesianism to say it had taught Keynesian economics and Keynesian economic policy had become an orthodoxy to the extent that it had taught governments how to deal with certain kinds of social conflict. And one of the principal mechanisms to deal with social conflict was to inflate. And so Nixon is often held up as sort of the prototypical inflator. You know, if we see a powerful labor movement unwilling to back down, demanding a greater share of the pie, and we also see a recalcitrant and increasingly angry racist capital demanding to keep their fair share, then one of the few tricks that he had in his bag to be able to do that was to inflate out of it. Getting off the gold standard in 1971 was, a key part of that. Insofar as that's the case, Keynesianism did arguably exonerate that decision. And insofar then as inflation became the bugbear of the early 70s, and then the unemployment that followed it, it's arguable that that really was a product of Keynesian thinking. But caught up in that Keynesian thinking, which produces the structural problem itself, is also a series of political economic norms, effectively, that really, really mattered a lot in a way and don't get discussed very often. So, for example, just to take a very straightforward example, if there was not a norm associated with a particular level of return for capital, then the redistributive pie, the struggle of the redistributive pie, could much more easily have led to a non-inflationary situation. If capital didn't demand levels of return like it historically associated with the 50s and 60s and wartime economies, then we could have had a situation where workers just got more and capital got less, and there would have been no problem. But we had built in a set of ideological structures that, of course, exacerbated the whole situation. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but
no, I think that captures at least some of it. So I'm going to ask one more broad question, and then we'll wrap up with a few questions that are more kind of timely in talking about this moment. So maybe this one's too technical, but can Geoff comment on the debate between profit-led and wage-led growth models within contemporary post-Keynesian theory? Does he seem one as being more loyal to Keynes's thought than the other? So a little bit more of an intermediary and not an introductory question, but the audience is asking.
Right. I will stay away from it only because it opens up so many other technical, what's the right word? Anyway, it opens up so many other technical questions that we could obviously debate not so much debate, but discuss for a long time.
If there's no simple answer, then I won't nail you in that. Here's another question if you want to make.
Can I just answer that one quickly?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
That if we're talking about fidelity to the Keynes's legacy specifically, it's profit led.
Right.
Okay. Entrepreneur is everything.
So there's one question that is from Adam King. Can Geoff comment on what constraints he sees the internationalization of capital placing on Keynesian economic ideas today?
Yeah, a lot. That's a really key question. And any attempt to revive Keynes today, which I think we see at the heart of a lot of really fantastic political, economic, and other kinds of proposals, the Green New Deal being perhaps the most obvious, faces this problem. Keynes designed his economics for not so much a closed economy, though theoretically, of course, he operated with a closed economy, but he designed his economics in a world in which states enjoyed a great deal of policy discretion, and he proposed that Bretton Woods only further, entrenched that sovereignty. We might think of as policy sovereignty. That is, at least right now, like a complete mischaracterization of much of the world, and that poses enormous problems for a return of Keynes's economics as opposed to Keynesian economics. I think that for the most part, any short-term or medium-term solution to those challenges inside Keynesian policymaking itself will require contingent thinking. Basically, things will have to be designed very specifically for particular conditions, particular situations, even particular relationships between this or that nation state. The idea that we can come out of this with some rules of thumb as to how the global economy might work that are called Keynesian, beyond the reimposition of capital controls and a great deal of economic sovereignty, we won't be able to do that.
So here's a question. You're a nice guy, Geoff. I'm not sure if you want to make enemies, but someone's asking you, what do you think about MMT? So if you want to find a way to shoehorn that, it is the internet, and the MMT is for all my feelings. Some people know my feelings about MMT. It's at least a great way for people to start thinking about economics in some ways. But do you have any MMT related comments?
Yeah. I have some thoughts on it. I don't think they're very well developed, to be honest with you. I think that the intuition behind MMT makes perfect sense to me. And it also seems to be bearing some truth at this moment, as many people have pointed out, including its biggest proponents. I also think that it requires a level of international coordination that's greater than, I think, what many of its proponents sometimes accept or are willing to think about. And that may be a problem that's solvable in the near term. But insofar as it right now especially encourages a kind of internalization of politics and a kind of turn toward nations solving their own problems, it only exacerbates the lack of international solidarity that currently exists. Now, one could suggest, I suppose, that MMT is transportable and every country could, operate according to its principles. At least at present, international political economy would suggest that there's no chance that's happening right now.
Yeah, and I think a lot of MMT proponents would talk about the particular kind of monetary sovereignty that a country like the US has that enables us to do these things, many of these things that they suggest, which just obviously other countries cannot do. And that could be a path towards, okay, this is the unique American road to social democracy. Often at Jacobin, we don't talk a lot about MMT, but we do talk about the particular role of the US kind of reserve currency status and how that might help us guard against capital flight and all these other potential problems. And obviously, that's a good thing. If there's a road in a couple countries to win, just referring to the capital flight thing, to win social democracy, that could only be a good thing. But if that's where the road ends, then we're just in kind of a tenuous left nationalism that will maybe deliver some gains for a couple decades and then be rolled back, and something worse will happen after.
Totally. Yeah.
But let me end. There's a few more questions, but it's already getting late. I want to end with a question from Marcus Grant, which is, how does debt play into this all? We just gave trillions to worthless corporations. If debt is as serious as some would claim, how do we enact Keynesianism when we already tossed out so much? And I guess maybe this is a broader question of like, how does a politics that relies on expansion, be it intervention in the economy, or be it just pumping money into certain sectors or expanding the welfare state to achieve certain social ends, how do we react in an environment in a couple of years that might favor deficit hawks because of debts that are being run up right now?
Yeah, and that's already happening here in Canada. Those folks have already started chirping. Hawks chirping. I thought that was a good pun.
It was good.
Thank you. But I mean, aside, I haven't put enough thought into this yet, so I don't want to pretend that I'm some expert, but it's a crucial issue. And I do think it actually re-raises the question of MMT, only insofar as we think of it as, one solution to this problem of debt, or at least a proposed solution. I mean, there is a sense in which at least at present, like I've made the argument a couple of times in the past and stuff that I've written, that Thomas Piketty is today's John Maynard Keynes. Maybe not at the level of fame and all this other stuff, but that his arguments are a general theory for the 21st century. And I think insofar as that's true, and I kind of think it is, the approach to this problem raises a whole bunch of questions, especially around how we might deal with the debt, which we obviously have to figure out some way to deal with it, even if it's just to write it off in the end. And one of the things that Piketty is most famous for, and I really, it's hard to argue with, is just his demand for much greater taxation, and especially much more progressive income and wealth taxation. Keynes himself actually advocated precisely this. So in his pamphlets, How to Pay for the War, and his policy recommendations in the 40s, he didn't say, just spend and we'll worry about the debt later, which, as you say, leads, at least these days, to an intensification of the power of the hawks, it seems. He said, tax the rich. That's what Keynes said. That is an entirely different way of dealing with debt. One that doesn't seem to be on the table very often in the discussions about MMT, which is so much oriented around a kind of emergency measures at the moment. But I think that in the end, not just for economic expediency, but also for social justice, that has to be, as long as we cling to the remnants of the social democratic state, which I'm not saying we shouldn't, but as long as we do, that progressive taxation, especially wealth taxation, has to be like the first answer to virtually almost any question.
Well, I'm looking for your Piketty review. I just started. My plan was to read the introduction and maybe part 4 that focuses on the U.S. So I do the grad student read of books. I read lots of introductions and I skim footnotes. But that's the job of an editor, to kind of know enough to bullshit and edit pieces. But you clearly know a lot about this topic because we've taken up like an hour and a half of your life. But I'm sure everybody watching is grateful. And once again, check out Geoff's book. We're going to put a link in the description. Press like and subscribe. And thanks once again for all your time.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it's an honor to get asked to do it. So I'm really happy I got a chance to do it.
That's great.
Right on. Take care of yourself, Bhaskar.
You too.
Thank you.